All right, recording has started. We are going to go ahead and begin. So, like I said, we're talking about U.S. foreign policy in the interwar period. We're going to be talking about right after World War I. Then we're going to talk about the overall general consensus of people. And then we're going to get into some issues that are happening in Europe that are going to concern the United States a little bit. So, first key point, easy peasy, straight up to the point. In the years following World War I, the U.S. pursued an unilateral foreign policy that used international investment, peace treaties, and selective military intervention. So very little military intervention, more peace treaties, more investment, more money spending. To promote a version of international order while maintaining U.S. isolationism. So the U.S. is trying to say, hey, we're isolated. We don't fight on wars. We don't do that stuff. But at the same time, their money and their diplomacy is trying to change, like modify the world a little bit. So that's the context for what's going on right after the First World War. I'll give you a little less than 2 minutes to get this in there, and then we will move forward. Going to move forward in just a little bit of time, about another 35 to 45 seconds. Make sure you have the first key point down and ready. We are missing a whole bunch of people today now that I look. That's concerning. All right, let's move forward. So, post-World War I, there are plenty of issues. One, America slips back into isolationism. This is mainly due to the efforts of President Warren G. Harding and the overall desire of the American people. They are sick of European issues, trouble affecting the United States, wars specifically. The idea of sending young Americans to die in European wars that seem to not really affect Americans is really, really problematic to a lot of people in the era. So right after World War I, after Wilson is gone, Warren G. Harding will be elected on the platform of returning to normalcy. You do not need to write this quote down, just point out specifics about it. His whole argument is we need to heal, not be heroes. We need to, restore, not be in revolutions. Like he's trying to point out, like, stay out of foreign entanglements. He wants nothing to do with them. He wants nothing to do with them at all. And because he's so anti-foreign entanglements, he gets a lot of support from people and he's elected really easily. So I'll give you a quick minute and a half for that first bullet point and the subpoints. That's really all you need on this slide. About a minute left on the clock. 1 minute. About 15 seconds. If you need more time, make sure you grab a screenshot. Otherwise, we're going to move forward. All right, let's go to move forward. Let's talk about tariffs and deals. So the outcome for isolation increases the appeal of tariffs, right? Because tariffs make the government money. And when no one wants to talk to Europe, it makes sense to not trade with them, to certain people. The first one in 1922 is the Fordney-McCumber Act, which as a whole raises the price of tariffs. But what you get in 1930 is something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Now, the Smoot-Hawley tariff will make things more expensive and really, really cripple those in the United States that depend on exporting goods overseas. International trade will decrease severely beyond like next to none, very little. Next thing is the Kellogg-Brand Act, which was a silly little attempt to make war illegal and to ultimately denounce war as a whole that the United States was a part of. The issue with this is, of course, that it's not effective due to no use of the League of Nations, as well as just overall not being a very, what would you say, like, it's not a very plausible thing that nations are just going to never war again. So it doesn't really work out for them. Also, side note, the Smoot-Hawley Act tariff will lead to will help the Great Depression along, will help keep it sad and depressed. Do you know the group that this hurts the most, these tariffs? Who do they hurt the most? The group that needed the international trade that didn't get it because of these tariffs, that couldn't afford to do it. They're severely hurt during the Great Depression. You guys remember the group of people or the type of person in the chat? If you don't, just put nope, no clue, don't remember. Nope. So they're talking about farmers, right? Farmers are the ones hurt the most of this. So if you didn't remember that from yesterday, you might want to write it in. The Joes, yeah, Farmer Joe, right? So I'll give you another quick minute and change, about a minute and a half. Then we'll move forward. All right, let's go to move forward. Let's get into the next thing. About 20 seconds left, and then we will move on and talk about the difference between an isolationist and an interventionist. All right. So an isolationist, which is a policymaker that wants to stay isolated, will argue that World War I cost too many American lives and got nothing done. Democracy, the world is not safe for democracy to happen. They will also argue about corporations making profits, and they will try to make the argument that, hey, maybe we're only fighting these wars for profits, and that's not good. Interventionists, though, people that want to get involved, will say that it's foolish to isolate from the issues going on in Europe. They will say that the Atlantic is no longer a buffer, right? Because isolationists will say, hey, well, the Atlantic Ocean's a buffer. But the interventionists will say, not really, because when the Atlantic Ocean was a buffer, George Washington was president, and that was a long time ago. And nowadays, we have more modern technology. There is nothing to stop or slow down the Germans if they were to defeat the British and keep them from messing with the United States. The Atlantic does not do that anymore. So we have to get involved if we want to keep the United States safe. is the argument being made. So two sides, two very different arguments. They're kind of opposites of each other. We'll go about 2 minutes and change on here to make sure you get all of the info because you need the definitions of the two sides and the arguments they are making. Then we will move on. We'll talk about key point 2, and we'll talk about the rise of these dictators and these leaders in Europe and the concern they will bring to a lot of the world. About 2 minutes left. A minute and change left on the clock. Make sure you got everything you need. We're going to move on very shortly to the next key point. About 40 seconds. All right, let's move forward. Let's talk about key point 2. In the 1930s, many Americans were concerned over the rise of fascism and totalitarianism. Many opposed taking military action against the aggressive Nazi Germany and Japan until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and drew the United States into the Second World War. So up until then, right up until Pearl Harbor was attacked, there are many Americans who do not want to get involved in the war at all. They already don't like some of the stuff Roosevelt's doing that we'll get into in a bit. But once the attack happens, everybody's like, all right, fair enough, and is ready for war. So I'll give you a quick 2 minutes, a little less 2 minutes. We'll do about 1:45 because we got to move through. Want to make sure we have enough time to talk about this. About 40 seconds left. All right, about I would say 25 seconds. Make sure you have the key point down. This is the last key point of the day, but we got a lot of slides to follow. Some for writing, some not so much. All right, so totalitarianism around the world in the chats. Either yes, either no, I don't know what that means, or yes, and here's the definition, right? Tell me what they mean. What's totalitarianism? Before we even get into this stuff, before you're even writing, what's totalitarianism? When I say that dude's a totalitarian, what does that mean? What do they do? You should already know this term. If you don't remember it, just put don't remember in the chat. You can send a private public, or if you do remember, tell me what it means. What makes a totalitarian totalitarian? Don't know. A couple of don't knows. Yes, so the government controls every aspect of society, right? Media, food, military, all of that. They also tend to use force a little bit sometimes, but that's not a requirement. But yeah, the government is in charge of everything. Usually they are also dictatorial. Usually there's one person at the head, right? So the first two bullet points are already key points that you've covered, right? Americans are using foreign policy to try to not intervene, but they're watching this stuff happen and it's concerning to them. It's harder and harder to maintain neutrality or isolation when they see these leaders take hold. You got Benito Mussolini in Italy, fascist, real fascist, first fascist to kind of take hold, kind of the only one since, depending on who you ask, but first fascist, big deal. Benito Mussolini in Italy. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany are taking hold of power. And then I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, but Hirohito is the Japanese emperor. And what's such a concern for him, he doesn't rise power or anything, he's the emperor, but he's growing more and more militaristic and dictatorial in his actions. And it's important to point out that like some historians think he's all to blame. They think that he's the one who wants to invade all these places and start the war and attack the United. They think it's all him. Others think it wasn't him at all. They think it was all generals and he was just kind of controlled, used as the figurehead. The truth is it's probably somewhere in the middle. Those are the two extremes. I tend to believe it's somewhere in the middle. He was in charge of some stuff. I do believe he wanted the war to happen. He wanted Japan to be great and powerful. But I do believe that there are some things that those generals and admirals were doing that he didn't have a say in. So I do think it's a little bit of both. But these leaders, what makes it so concerning, it's one thing if, hey, there's a dictator over there. Hey, there's another one. It's one thing if that's happening. But what these dictators start to do is they start to become aggressors within their own territories and spheres of influence. They start invading their neighbors. And that is a big no-no. You cannot do that. So for this first slide, all you really need to do is get the names and the nation they're from. And on the next slide, we'll talk about where they started attacking. And then we'll get into details about the interwar years of the very specific nations that make up the Axis powers. Tell you a cool story about John Rabe. I think his name's Rabe. Probably pronouncing his name all wrong. So I'll give you about another minute and 15 seconds to get the names of the leaders in and the nation they're from. All right, let's go to move forward. So, aggressive militarism. Again, what makes these dictators so dangerous is not only that they are dictators, not only that they are Nazis and fascists and all this stuff, but that they are also attacking their neighbors. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, big deal. They're showing that they're willing to capture place. They take over the country there and put in a puppet state and pretend they're not in charge. Americans will watch as Germans occupy the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. So will Britain and France, by the way. And Americans will watch as Italy invades Ethiopia. Americans are troubled by all of this, but they still want to stay out of the war. There isn't a war yet, but they want to stay out of it. They don't want anything to do with all this trouble. But what happens is in 1939, which is like his fifth and fourth invasion by that point, fifth if you count the two Czechoslovakian ones, Hitler will invade Poland with the Soviet Union, and the war will officially begin. When the war starts, it is there's this period known as the phony war in the middle, where both sides don't know if they're going to really fight, and then the fighting begins. But the war will start, and it'll be unlike any other war fought before. So I'm going to give you another quick 90 seconds because you need to make sure you get in the info from here, and then we're going to get into the specifics of each nation state and what they did and how they fought. Initially, early on, we're not going to get into the full fighting of the war itself or America. We're just going to talk about what the Axis powers did in the interwar years, their acts of aggression, so to speak. About 30 seconds left. Make sure you have this info down before we move on. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's talk first about Italy. So there's no real words on this slide. You don't really need to know much other than in 35, I believe, Italy invades Ethiopia. And Benito Mussolini is a very formidable politician. He was a fascist. He was a cruel dictator. He ruled his nation with an iron fist. But the Italian war machine is not exactly great. It's not very modern. The technology is not really there. They're not really powerful. Their equipment's not very good. Like the Karanka rifles they use kind of suck. The tanks they have are all out of date. Like they're not a great militaristic nation. Mussolini thinks he is, and Mussolini acts like it, and Mussolini talks like it. And when they invade Ethiopia, everything looks fine. Bite-sized Panzer. It's worse. It's like it's not even that it's small. It's just that it's outdated. It's like World War I armor and tech and gun size. It's not great because there's little tanks like that, like little M4 Stuarts or like the Panzer Mark IIIs, I think. But those tanks are really good and they're really fast and effective. These are bad tanks. Like they're not great. And the problem is, so Mussolini's Hitler's greatest ally, right? They're best buddies. And he invades Ethiopia and he takes Ethiopia. And it looks really great and it looks awesome. So then in 39, when the war starts, he's going to invade Greece. And he wants this massive, like, a new Roman Empire, blah, 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 right? Because big military talker. And initially, everything looks fine. They're like, yeah, we're invading Greece. We're Italy. We're doing great stuff. But then they run into a couple of British groups, like a small group, like a couple of divisions, like a small group of British soldiers. And those British soldiers stop the Italians, like dead in their tracks. Because the British army is really good, right? And it's just a few, but they stop them. And then the British force starts pushing the Italians back, the smaller British force, pushing the Italians back. The Italians are getting their butts kicked. They're getting ruined and destroyed. So what Hitler has to do is send in German troops to help the Italians, right? You guys have heard of Rommel and the Desert Fox and like the fighting in Africa. That starts because Hitler's got to fix Mussolini's mess, right? And I'm being really general when I say that. We'll get into more detail a little bit later. But the reason there's fighting in Africa is because Italy trying to overextend, not being able to do anything, and all these different offenses that happened. And then, we got to invade Africa. So Italy, not a great military. That's why if you look up Mussolini and you see he's almost interpreted as kind of like a fool, like a foolish guy. Don't make that mistake. He's not foolish. He was very formidable as a politician, but his military really did not support all the talking he did. It was not great. Let's talk about Germans. So you don't have to write a lot of this stuff. Actually, Germany, they had a lot of tanks. I don't know about that. Italy, kind of crazy. But with Germany, what happened is in 1936, they marched into the Rhineland. which was old German territory, and they occupied it. And this was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But Hitler was like, do something. And France was like, no. And so they directly violated the Treaty of Versailles. Up until that point, everything Germany had been doing, they'd kind of been doing in secret. They'd been building up their military, but in secret. They'd been designing and building tanks, but they were doing it in secret in the Soviet Union. They were designing and building warplanes, but they were putting seats in them and hiding them and saying like, oh, look, passenger plane. Then you rip all the seats out and it's a Stuka dive bomber. Like they were doing stuff like that to kind of hide what they were doing. But once they violate the Treaty of Versailles and France doesn't attack, some historians will say that if France had attacked them or done something, that it would have ended right there. But France doesn't. They hold off. And Germany's just keeps on violating, like out in the open. Like, okay, we're going to build up our Navy now. We're going to build up our Air Force, blah, 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 blah. In 1938, a few years later, when he's had some time to strengthen up, Germany annexes Austria. Then they will invade Czechoslovakia. After that first Czechoslovakia invasion, Neville Chamberlain of Britain and a couple of leaders from France, they will meet with Hitler. They'll be like, Hitler, listen, stop invading places. Like, you can have this, you can have what you've taken, but don't take any more, okay? You promise? And Hitler was like, okay, I promise. And so Neville Chamberlain flies back to England very famously. He looks kind of foolish now, says, we have peace in our time, right? He holds up the paper in his hand. We've done it. There's peace. We're not going to have to fight a war this year. You know, World War I sucked. We're not going to have to do that again. And then when Neville Chamberlain gets off the plane, he finds out that Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then there's this weird time where it's like, hey, man, Hitler, I thought we were cool. Like, Hitler's a cool guy. And then Hitler actively defied him. Okay, but Hitler no more. And Hitler's like, okay, promise. Then he invades Poland, right? And then the war begins. The era prior to the invasion of Poland, that awkward moment, is known as the era of appeasement, right? It's Britain and France giving in to Hitler, giving him the things he wants, hoping it won't start a war, not realizing it's letting him get stronger in order to start a war. Yeah, so Neville Chamberlain, you know, even when I described him, right, it's hard to take him serious or describe him as this like really formidable politician when he was very, very wrong. And when a lot of the things he did may have helped lead to the war starting. The one thing appeasement does allow, no one will tell you this, like very few, like I didn't learn this till college. Yes, but that might have been after he captured it, but yes, because they did that meeting was in Berlin, the Neville Chamberlain meeting, where he's like, hey, Hitler buddies, like you're cool. And Hitler was like, yeah, I'm cool. And then he just didn't, that was in Berlin. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, so the thing about appeasement, what it does do, and again, I didn't learn this till college, till I took English history. It allows the Allies to get ready for the war too. Because the Allies weren't ready. Like the British Air Force in 1935 is like nothing. They build it up during these years because they're realizing, like a lot of the military leaders anyways are realizing, this Hitler guy, don't think he's going to stop. Like Neville Chamberlain thinks they're cool, but a lot of people know it's not going to happen. So without appeasement, it's hard to say what would have happened because nobody was ready for war. It gives the nations time to get ready for war as well. And then in 1939, when the war breaks out, everybody's a little more ready. Side notes, and I want to make this note just to talk about it. The French were really good military, right? They were the backbone of the Allies in the First World War, but the Second World War is very different. It's not the way wars used to be fought, right? Armored divisions, things like that. And what the French, like a couple of things they do wrong. Their Air Force is bad. They don't really have air superiority. The Germans do. England's also not sending planes to help them out because they need to defend them to defend Britain, which is true. They need to keep them to defend Britain. But on top of that, they do this thing with their tanks, and it's really weird, and it's one of their biggest tactical errors. It's part of why they lose so quickly. Every other major power in this war will have their tanks in big groups, right? They're called tank divisions. And instead of just having some soldiers and a tank, you've got a big group of a bunch of tanks and no soldiers because tanks move faster than people do, right? And that's how Germans fight. That's how the British fight. That's how the Americans fight. That's how a lot of them, the Japanese fight that way. But what the French do, because they're French, just like their red pants, they would put an infantry division and they'd have like a tank with them or two tanks. And they would use their tanks like that, almost like artillery pieces. And they weren't that good of a tank to begin with. They weren't great tanks, but like they didn't have radios in them either, so they couldn't communicate outside of the tank. They weren't great tanks and they didn't use them effectively. And when they fought Germans, part of why Blitzkrieg is so devastating to the French, which had this really good, powerful, strong army, is because they're just tactically not as prepared as other nations are. They didn't think armored divisions were the way to go. They thought, no, support infantry with tanks. No, don't put radios in them. They don't need those things. And they're devastated, right? They're ruined. Some of the bravest soldiers you'll ever know that fought in this conflict were French soldiers. They're like defending the British escape at Dunkirk. Those guys were heroes. Those guys were awesome. So they fought really hard for as long as they fought, but they just didn't fight for that long of a time. Part of it is tactical mistakes made. Are there any questions about any of this stuff? This is all mostly context, right? So you know what we're getting into in the pre-war years. This is going to lead to the Battle of Britain, which was Britain defending the island with a lot of warplanes, it's basically a big air plane battle that lasts for a few days or weeks, depending on who you ask. Good stuff. There were that, like, really, it was like, hey, tank over there, and they can't move it. Like, they have to get into the tank to talk to the tank crew. They didn't have radios inside. It's really ridiculous with hindsight. It's almost as ridiculous as the red pants. You know what I mean? Like, it's rough. It was rough. They had a bad time of it, and they still fought really hard, like harder than most, but it's so devastating, the German Blitz, and it's something that no one was really expecting or knew how to deal with. Dive bombers are a relatively new thing, and they're really effective. They're probably as effective as modern bombers, if not a little more. Like the style is really risky and dangerous. That's why no one does it anymore. But yeah, it was really accurate. It's more accurate than regular bombers were. You guys know dive bombers. The way it works is you just fly really, really close to the ground. And then there's a certain point where you drop the bomb and then you pick up, right? And you're exposed while you're doing this. It's part of why, like Spitfires and stuff, when Spitfires start becoming a thing, like they rip these dive bombers up when they go down. But you need superiority in the skies to do it effectively, but they're really devastating. Because you can hit like that, oh, there's a tank over there, and then you can hit it with a dive bomber, whereas a big bomber, it's a luck of the draw if you hit it at all. Lastly, we're going to talk about Japanese aggression. The Japanese aggression begins earliest. In 1931, they invade Manchuria. By 1932, the conflict is over, and they set up a puppet state in Manchuria to kind of run the country. They're in charge of it, essentially. In 1937, they will invade China. For the resources, they want the Japanese empire to expand. Something about the Japanese, they're pretty racist. They believe themselves superior to all other Asian races and all other races in general. They are also ruthless and cruel. They committed some of the worst atrocities in the entire war, especially in Nanking, which is like the one of the major Chinese cities at the time. And they will commit horrible atrocities. They will kill wounded people. They will murder families. They will kill children. They will do unspeakable things to women and civilians. They will devastate the city of Nanking specifically because of the type of fighting that was taking place in Nanking. And they do this in a lot of places. The reason I'm pointing this out is because the United States specifically will deal with Japan, right? Japan is why the United States gets in the war. But on top of that, I want to talk about this guy, John Rabe, in Nanking. So Nanking is an international city. There's Americans, British, there's all sorts of white folks in Nanking in China. There for business, supporting the people, missionaries, things like that, right? And when the Japanese invade, these international citizens set up an international safety zone. And it was like, hey, Japan, promise, don't attack. There's a lot of white people here. And then the Japanese are like, sure. But there's also a lot of Chinese civilians in there. And the Japanese still occupy the area, but they're not going to go through like door-to-door shooting everybody like they did in other neighborhoods. Now, enter John Rabe. John Rabe is a businessman who's lived in China for a long time. He really loves the Chinese people. And when he sees what's being done to them, he's horrified. He's outraged. And he will spend the entire conflict, the entire time Japan is in Nanking, not necessarily fighting them with violence, but fighting them, like resisting the Japanese troops, saving civilians by the dozen, by the group. He will walk up to Japanese soldiers and be like, no, do something. Don't hurt these people, leave. Like, do something about it, I dare you. And then the Japanese soldiers kind of walk away and don't hurt him. And he single-handedly saves hundreds, if not more, the numbers vary, of Chinese civilians in this international safety zone. He sends them in there. He lets them stay at his house in his estate, like in tents all over his estate, up and down it, and his fenced estate, and in the house as well. He will patrol the estate with like a flashlight to make sure Japanese soldiers don't go in there and try to hurt the people. He does all of this awesome stuff, and he outright will resist these soldiers. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a question. I want some answers in the chat. Why don't the Japanese hurt him? Why don't they just kill him or get rid of him or shoot him like they did pretty much everybody else in Nanking who challenged them? What do you think? There's no real wrong answers here. I just want to hear what you think. Like, why won't they hurt him? He's powerful and important. That's a good one. What else? Remember, he's a businessman. He's lived there a long time. He really loves the people. Why aren't they hurting him? He's just some white guy that's bald with glasses. He's not so scary. He doesn't have an army. The Japanese do. What else we got, guys? Why won't they hurt him? Just take a guess. Risk going to war because he's an American. That's a good one, too. Anything else? So you guys are, those of you guys that, by the way, thank you for participating. Guys. You're partially right. He is important and he's fairly powerful. The Japanese are not going to kill him, not because he's an American. They're using him in exchange. That's another good one. So here's what happens, guys. He's not American. He is a white guy, but he's not American. John Rabe is from the nation of Germany. And not only is he from the nation of Germany, he is a card-carrying, band-wearing Nazi. And the Nazis are Japan's only ally. So where the Americans that are, for example, the Americans and the British people that are in that zone do not dare do the stuff John Rabe does, because the Japanese will smack them across the head, hurt them, shoot them, will do stuff to them. And they'll pretend they didn't, but they will do it. But John Rabe is a Nazi. He's their friend, or his country is, right? And the Japanese are they're a very disciplined army, which is why when people say that, oh, what they did wasn't like on purpose, like they did it on purpose and they knew they were doing it. If they get orders, they follow them, right? And they knew you cannot hurt this guy. And I'm going to show you some more pictures of him because it's so fascinating. This is a Chinese movie, by the way. So when you see these color pictures, it's a Chinese movie. There's an armband missing. He wore this one because he's a humanitarian. He's there helping people. But there's paintings like this one where you see the Nazi armband. The flag is probably not real, but the armband, he wore that armband, guys, like a shield. And he would walk around Nanking, walk around his estate, and get these soldiers to go away. He would really stand face to face like that with them or like this and be like, no, do something. You're not going to hurt these people. Get out of here. And they would back down. And it's really fascinating. It's one of these fascinating human stories, right, about this guy. The Chinese love this guy. He's like a superhero to Chinese people. It's a Chinese film. And it's because of it's really heroic what he did. And he's a Nazi. Like, you know what I mean? It's hard to praise a Nazi, but it's hard not to praise what he did, because I cannot stress enough when I say the Japanese are doing some of the same stuff, if not worse stuff, than the Germans are doing to Jews and stuff like that. It's almost like you have to, he's an anomaly. Throughout the entire war with Japan, he's calling like Germany and trying to talk to Hitler and be like, Hitler, you got to tell these guys to chill. Like what they're doing is wrong. Like he really is, because he's seeing it firsthand and he's seeing it happen to people that he really like, he likes being in China. He likes those people. He really likes living there. And the way he sees what's happening to his home, it's like horrible. And what he sees being done to these people is horrible. And he's a card-carrying Nazi. Some people, I don't know if I believe them, but we'll argue that maybe like by the end, he's not really a Nazi, but I don't think he really knows what they're doing, maybe. But like either way, regardless, he uses that swastika, that red armband. He wears it all day. He wore it around everywhere. In the movie, they don't do it because it's 2020 and people don't understand history. And that's like a shield. And he uses it to straight up like call these people out. And he does it like relentlessly. This is, I think this one's in China. This is, I think, the house. I believe this is the state, and this is like the monument. The other one up here, the larger one, that's his in Berlin. That's his tombstone.
Sir.
Yes.
But what is he? He's like a general?
No, he was just a businessman. He was just a German civilian, but he was a member of the Nazi party, because the Nazis were a political party, right? But he was a member, and he had that armband and stuff, but he wasn't a general. That's what makes it so fascinating. He's a regular guy. He was just a businessman living in China. And he was like, nope. And he wasn't going to let that happen to these people. So it's really fascinating. He's not really a leader. He's just a business guy.
But he was on the side of the Nazis.
Well, he was a Nazi. Yeah. He was like a civilian in the Nazi. Like he was in the Nazi government. He was a businessman in the Nazi. He was a Nazi. But he wasn't fighting the war. He was just living in China. And he was helping Chinese civilians against the Japanese.
Oh, okay. But wait, didn't the Japanese team up with the Nazis at one point?
Yeah, that's why he's able to stand up to them because they can't hurt
Oh,
him. If he was an American, they could have hurt him. They could have gotten rid of him for all the damage he caused and would have just said, you know, want to know what happened, right? They would have taken that risk, but he's not American. He's a Nazi. They know better. He's the only Nazi in China. You know what I mean? They can't
yeah.
because he's supposed to be their friend. So when he
Mm.
stands up to them and he says, do something, I dare you, they're not going to do anything. It's a really interesting story. He's a really fascinating figure. There's a lot of really good books on him that I would recommend you guys look into if you're curious. Yeah, I do remember people trying to cancel Jojo Rabbit also. Such a good movie. But that's John Rabe. It's a really cool story. I like telling it. A lot of people don't know about it. Like I didn't learn about him till I was in college reading the book about the rape of Nanking, which is what the event that he's in is known as. It's known as the rape of Nanking. Some postmodernists will call it the Nanking Massacre. It just depends which history you're reading. But yeah, really fascinating figure. So let's bring it back. Let's talk about America. So all of these things, the stuff in Japan, the stuff in China, stuff in Germany and Europe, the stuff in Italy, it's all happening. And FDR is in a weird position. He's like an intervening isolationist in the sense that he really, really, really sympathizes with Britain. They're standing by themselves. They're fighting Germany. He wants to help them, but he knows he doesn't have the support of the population. So what he ends up doing is he's trying to get involved as much as he can while appearing to not get involved at all. And he does that through 3 different programs. The first one, cash and carry. The cash and carry program, he loosens the neutrality laws in the United States and says, hey, any belligerent war nation, any nation fighting a war right now can buy armaments from us, the United States, as long as you pay cash up front and you transport them yourself. So bring your own ships, put them on, and take them back home. Americans are not going to be involved with it, and you're paying us cash up front. And he does this knowing full well that Britain controls the seas. That because Britain has the largest navy in the world, there's no way a German warship is going to make it all the way to the United States and all the way back, you know? So he does this to help Britain. When Britain starts running out of cash because they've been fighting a war and the wars are expensive, he does the Destroyers for Bases program, which is the U.S. will give Britain destroyers, American destroyers, which are warships, for land rights on various British possessions. Like, oh yeah, let us use that land, let us build a base there, here's a destroyer. Like they would do that stuff. And then the big one that people will say bring the U.S. practically into the war without quite doing it is the Lend-Lease bill, where Britain will get arms that they need from the United States, weapons, vehicles, on credit. So we're basically lending it to them, and then they pay us back later. These are the 3 ways that Roosevelt gets involved, but without quite getting involved. So I'll give you a quick 2 minutes on here. There's a lot of info. This is pretty much the last big slide you need. The rest of it's all just Pearl Harbor stuff, and then we'll move forward. A little bit more time, about 40 seconds, then we're going to move on. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. So this will all come to a head, and it will all kind of end when the United States is attacked by Japan. The United States is really the only threat to Japanese superiority in the Pacific. The British are barely there. The French are gone from the war, and America has the big Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. And America's already kind of like testing Japan. They're being like, "Hey, sanctions. No more trading with you. Blah blah blah, stuff like that." So the Japanese will launch a surprise attack, but famously, and we talked about this already, right? The surprise attack does not sink any American aircraft carriers, does not damage the repair stations or the fuel storage units, I believe. So the fleet is damaged, but it is not by any means crippled. It is just hurt. And a lot of the ships are repaired very quickly, and the fleet is back in action. That night, Roosevelt will ask Congress for a declaration of war on Japan. He will get it. And then Germany, in one of the decisions that is often questioned of Hitler, is the second that the United States declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on the United States. And thus the United States is at war with both Germany and Japan, leading us right into the Second World War, which we will continue tomorrow. So I'll give you a quick minute to get this down, and then we will move on to the exit ticket and talk about what we're doing there. Epic what? The Second World War? It's going to be good. We'll talk about it. A little bit more time, and then we're going to move forward, talk about the exit ticket, and we will be done. All right, let's go to move forward. So exit ticket time, where are we at? So the exit ticket is very straightforward, very simple, easy peasy stuff. Explain why America wanted to return to isolationism after the First World War. Second one, explain what issues are arising in Europe in the interwar years that would lead to concern from the United States and the Allies. And then identify the event, that should say event, not even, that dragged the United States into the war. So that is all we are doing. That is all the exit ticket is. It is easy peasy. You've got about 3 minutes left in class. That should be more than enough time to get it done.